This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about child language learning, also known as child language acquisition. I actually prefer the latter term because I think that when a child is, quote, learning a language, he or she is really not learning it, they're more acquiring it, and I'll explain why in a second. First, let me thank all my listeners for their patience in this episode. I know that there's been quite a delay from the time the last episode was released to this one. I mean, what can I say? This is something that I do in my spare time, and I don't always have as much spare time as I would like to. Pursuing a doctoral degree is something that can definitely take its toll in terms of your week schedule. That's all I'll say on that. I will make them as quickly as I feel I can do comfortably. And if it means having a delay, a longer delay here and there, then that's what it means. I mean, there's not much else I can say on that topic. Anyway. I am very excited about this episode today because it's sort of completing a trilogy of sorts. The last two episodes have concerned language learning in some way, shape, or form. 2 episodes ago, we started talking about routinization, where I analogized language learning, adult language learning, that is, to things like learning the cello. And let me say a couple extra words on that before I move on. I didn't mention this in that episode, but language learning in general, especially second language learning, is something that it's a topic that is still very hotly contested in many areas of linguistics. And certainly my analogy, saying that language learning is similar to learning the cello in some way, would be flatly rejected by many linguists, mostly generative linguists, I would think. However, my point there was to suggest that there exists some sort of cognitive framework for learning, which is the backdrop, if you will, the subsystem for all learning tasks. That is to say that there will be some shared elements between learning a language and learning the cello. And the shared element that I was pointing out in particular in that episode was routinization, also known as cognitive entrenchment. And that view I don't think is that radical. So let me just reiterate that. That the view that I gave in that episode is not necessarily the most common view among linguists. So generative linguists would say that because you have certain issues of innateness in language learning, that learning a language and learning the cello are probably very much different things, much more different than they are alike. And I suspect that depending upon the devotion of a linguist to the innateness hypothesis, they would possibly even say that there is nothing in common with learning the cello and learning a language. I don't consider myself a generative linguist. I do consider myself someone who has great interest in cognitive linguistics as well as psycholinguistics and language processing, and I think that from that standpoint, it appears foolish to say that there is nothing in common between, quote-unquote, regular learning and language learning. And that was the main point I was really trying to drive home in that episode about routinization, is that if you're routinizing finger movements in playing the cello, or you're routinizing muscle movements in speech, is there really a big difference there? And I would argue no. Last episode, my wife joined me, and we had a sort of informal discussion about adult language learning in the classroom, and I used that as sort of anecdotal evidence for my view on routinization. So what I was arguing is that what she seemed to remember most of from her language classes as an adult was not the sort of nitty-gritty conjugation charts for verbs or things like that. She didn't remember the unique elements as such, but she remembered a lot of phrases, and she remembered a lot of larger units that we wouldn't necessarily call atomic. So we would refer to them certainly as phrases or something like that, or at least constituents. That seemed to be what she retained most. And obviously, from a construction grammar point of view, construction grammar, of course, I introduced in the episode on routinization, that would be the expectation, is that you would see that these items, which are not just building blocks, would be retained more readily because they are routinized as entire units and not just as their parts. So that was the idea behind the last episode, was just sort of give some anecdotal support for what I had put forth in the previous episode. Today, we're sort of going to leave that for two reasons. One, I'm not familiar with a lot of the construction grammar accounts of child language learning. Construction grammar, compared to things like generative grammar and the innateness hypothesis, is very young. I'm not sure that there is a lot of work with child language learning concerning a construction grammar approach and an approach of routinization and things like that. I'm sure there is some work, at least, but what work there is, I'm not familiar with, and so I don't feel it would be right for me to sort of talk about construction grammar in the child language acquisition sense. Two, the largely predominant view for child language learning, even more so for adult language learning, is the generative view. That is to say that there are some innate, there's something innate going on with child language learning, and I think it's harder to argue against that in terms of child language acquisition than it is for adult language learning. For adult language learning, issues of innateness, I think, are harder to point a finger at. But for child language learning, there's definitely something going on there, and I will explain that in just a second. So, first and foremost, why do I call it child language acquisition, or what I would prefer to call it child language acquisition instead of child language learning? Well, when you hear the term learning, it brings to mind the things that we talked about in the previous two episodes. So the methods that adults will use to learn a language, be they methods based on generative theory, so teaching the parts, methods based more on whole word theories or construction grammar theories, so teaching the whole. This sort of thing is done for adults in the language classroom. So it's assumed, and indeed it must be the case, that an adult learning a second language knows a first language. Obviously, that's why it's called second language learning. Now, some books will call this second language acquisition. I think in that case, the opposite term would be more appropriate. So second language learning, child language acquisition. Why? Well, as it turns out, it's incredibly difficult to get a child not to learn at least one language. And by incredibly difficult, I mean that there are a handful, not even a handful, of known cases worldwide of children not learning a human language. One such case is that of Jeannie. And the history of Jeannie is sort of gruesome, so I'll let you guys Wikipedia it on your own time. I won't go that much into detail, but essentially Jeannie, for the first 13 years of her life, was raised in isolation. She never left the room in which she was kept. She was born in 1957, and she was discovered in 1970 in that room. And this is very interesting because she essentially had very, very little contact with anyone, and certainly not a lot of linguistic input from anyone, being confined to that room. So she was 13 when she was discovered, and she could not communicate verbally. She's still alive. She's, 54 now. However, she still, to my knowledge, does not have verbal communication skills. Now, she has some communication skills through other forms of sign. However, she lacks a lot of what we would call linguistic competence. So the ability to do things like, speak a normal human language, or even sign a normal human language. I don't believe that she is capable to this day of performing linguistic tasks as one would expect a person to be able to perform linguistic tasks. And the question is why? So we know that attempts were made to teach her language after she was discovered, and yet she seems not to respond in the way that we would expect. So this is a case of a child not learning a language, and this actually sheds a lot of light on what goes on when children acquire language. Note that she was 13 when she was discovered, and after that age, she was not able to acquire language in the same way. Now, contrast this with a typical child in a typical situation where they get X amount of input from the outside world, and they're able to produce utterances at a very young age, and by the age of 5 or so, they've mastered their native language. Now, think about this for a second. The age of 5. Now, most school systems will start around 4 or 5. Some start even later than that. And even in those school systems which start early, you don't start learning about the intricacies of English grammar until a few years in. Certainly not right off the bat. You start learning about writing pretty early on. But if you remember from episode 1, writing is not language. Writing is a representation of language. All the children who are learning to write and read can already speak very, very well. So the question is, how do these children acquire the language without being taught? So this is the primary reason why I say that the term child language learning is sort of a misnomer. Really, it's child language acquisition. Nobody's sitting down and teaching these children language in the way that you teach an adult language. All you have to do around a child is talk, and they seem to pick it up automatically. Now, back to Jeannie. Why did she not acquire language in this way? Well, she didn't have enough input is the clearest reason. Why did she not acquire it after she started getting input after the age of 13? And this introduces us to the concept of critical period. So the critical period in child language acquisition is a period in which something is different about the brain. I say something because this is still one of those kind of unknowns to this day. However, the existence of the critical period is hard to deny given cases like Jeannie's. So something is different in the brain which allows for the sort of ready acquisition, the eager acquisition, if you will, of language, such that you don't need to give these children regular instruction in order to have them learn a language. And so what is different about it? Well, I've heard things from brain plasticity, so the brain is making more connections than it does later on in life, and therefore it's sort of known as the plastic period, where it's more malleable, and therefore when you speak around a child, they're trying to connect meanings to the sounds they hear, and that makes them ripe for learning a language in this way, or acquiring a language rather. That's one thing I've heard of. The Chomskyan point of view is a language acquisition device, the LAD, which is this innate mechanism, if you will, in the child mind, which predisposes them to learn human language. That's closely related to things like principles and parameters theory, which today is not really widely accepted, but has morphed into other kinds of things like the minimalist program and things like this, which again are the Chomskyan theories, and they suggest that there's some kind, principles and parameters, for example, was the idea that you have all these possible parameters that can be set by human languages, and that a child just needs to hear enough to set the switch for all these possible parameters, and that helps them greatly to figure out how grammars work. And of course, that view requires that the switches themselves are innate. In other words, they're born with them. Just like some animals are born knowing how to swim, children would be born knowing how grammars work in some way. The classic principles and parameters example was pro-drop. So pro-drop is something that occurs in some languages where if you don't need a subject pronoun because there's already subject information on the verb, then you drop the subject pronoun. And some languages allow pro-drop and some languages do not. And if a child hears enough input where there's no subject pronoun, they flip the pro-drop switch and they know that it's okay to drop a subject. And if they don't hear it, then apparently they don't flip the switch. Now, how many times do they have to hear it to flip the switch? Well, who knows? That's one of the holes, in my opinion, of principles and parameters theory. And like I said, it's no longer readily accepted by a lot of people. But I certainly have heard of it, and you should have too, because it's been a big deal because it was proposed by Chomsky. So, is that all we know about the critical period? Well, I think in a nutshell, yes. Certainly there's more intricate details than that, but in a nutshell, there exists a period wherein children readily acquire language without instruction, and it's known as the critical period. There has been some research, by the way, to sort of harken back to 2 episodes ago, there has been some research that does suggest that there exist critical periods for other things that are non-linguistic. Learning piano, for example. If you want to learn a musical instrument, you teach a child at a very young age. Now, sort of anecdotally, and the common sense view is that, well, yes, if you teach a child at a very young age to play an instrument, they will be very good by the time they're an adult. The question is it because you taught them when they were a child, or is it because there's so much time that will have passed from when they were a child to when they're an adult? I think that's at issue there. However, there has been some research that suggests that, yes, you do get more than just the time. There's something additional at play when you have a child learn a musical instrument inside their critical period. Now, whether or not it's the same critical period, that's still up for debate, right? But certainly that's an area that is being heavily researched right now, trying to figure out how critical periods work and what the relationship between them all is, and exactly what is behind this sort of relatively quick acquisition of incredibly complex things. So we know that there's a critical period. The first question we should have is, how long is it? Again, estimates will vary. Certainly, it doesn't last till 13, right? Because if it did, then we would expect that Jeannie would have perhaps acquired language after she was discovered. The most common number I hear of is 7. So before the age of 7, the critical period is active, and after that, it's inactive. I've heard about concepts of a second critical period in the late teens. Maybe, who knows? Let's learn about the first one before we worry ourselves with that. But, this is all stuff that's been discussed. Now, as it turns out, even if you accept that there's a critical period, you still have a problem, because we don't know exactly how the critical period works. We don't know exactly how children do pick up language in such a structured way from just what seems to be random input. And this has been a long-standing argument for the language acquisition device of Chomsky, has been something known as the poverty of the stimulus. And that's the argument that says that you don't have enough stimulus coming into the child for them to make such robust grammars. So, in other words, the intricacies of the rules that they end up intrinsically knowing are so fine-grained that without instruction, they shouldn't be able to know them, given that they're just hearing people speak around them. So it's the claim that the mind cannot produce such a systematic representation of language, without being it presented to them in a systematic nature, and B, with the amount of input that they receive. That was a very commonly used for support of the language acquisition device. This innate mechanism, which allows children to learn. It was a commonly used for support of like principles and parameters. The parameters being innate, well, they must be, because that's the only way that you get this sort of systematicity out of grammatical representations in the child brain. And now that's being challenged. So one other area of research in child language acquisition currently is learning theories. So looking at ways that these super detailed grammatical representations, which are able to produce utterances of the complexity that we know children produce them, making those out of stimulus that is impoverished, to use the Chomskyan term, poverty of the stimulus, giving not a lot of stimulus and still getting a very detailed result. Can you explain acquisition of that kind without saying that there was already something in the brain? That's the question. And there's sort of two camps, right? So you have the innateness camp and the non-innateness camp. And they're still going at each other to this day, and they have for quite some time, and probably will for quite some time. Okay, so that's the sort of issue at large. Critical period. Do they already have some sort of structure in their brain from birth? Must they, given the nature of the stimulus? Now, into some more nitty-gritty. So some things that we know are the same across children, seemingly worldwide, regardless of language. So that's one thing to point out here, is that it's not generally accepted as the case that a child learning English will have a more difficult time than a child learning Japanese, or German, or French, or any other language that you could think of, Swahili, right, Jirabal. There is no evidence, to my knowledge, that children in general will be later bloomers than others, if you will. Now, that's not to say that there aren't individual differences, but of course with this sort of thing we're looking at averages. And the average amount of time for children to acquire language is the same regardless of the language. Okay, and that leads to all sort of questions. Well, does that mean that every language is equally complex? Which of course is the standard sort of view, and certainly it does seem that way. Yes, that's very good evidence for languages being so similar in structure that indeed they can be learned with the equal amount of time, given whatever mechanism is behind child acquisition. So what sort of averages do we have? Well, we have several stages of child language acquisition, which seem to be somewhat standard, somewhat expected. The first stage is the babbling stage, that you get at about 6 months of age. And this is when children are just experimenting with their vocal tracts and seeing what kinds of sounds they can produce. The types of sounds that they produce at this stage generally are not that related to the language spoken around them, right? So you will have children produce sounds that aren't sounds of the language of the parents, for example. And that's why we call it babbling, right? So they're really just finding the limits of their capacity to make noise. That's what the babbling stage is about. Now, at about 1 year of age, so 6 months later, you start getting the first word stage, where you'll have single words that are produced. Now, I should mention that these words generally are not perfect representations of the words that they're trying to say, right? So there are phonological issues on top of all this that I'll go into after I get done with the stages here. But in terms of recognizable words, you start getting that at about 1 year. At about 2 years of age, you get the first grammatical morphemes. So these are things like the past tense ending, the plural ending, things like that in English would all be grammatical morphemes. You start seeing those at about 2 years of age. About 4 years of age, 4 to 5, is when you see what they call basic mastery. So that's to say that they can pretty much produce an infinite number of sentences, given a finite number of rules, which of course is what everybody does with language. That comes about at about 4 to 5 years of age. So that's the stage where they are fully fluent in a language, not only in competence but in performance. Now, past that, there's of course continued learning, but it's mostly things like lexical items. So you're always expanding your vocabulary. You're adding jargon depending on specific sub areas that you work in, and that never really ends, right? So that's a stage that seems to continue throughout life. But in terms of the structure of the language, you've already got it by the time you're 5 or so. So that really is quite amazing that sort of thing happens. Now, like I said, the first word stage, and actually even past the first word stage, you find phonological differences between child speech and adult speech. So some things that they will do is they'll hear a certain sound, they'll be able to recognize that certain sound. So they'll hear a word like thumb, and they'll hear that it indeed has the interdental fricative at the beginning, but for some reason they can't produce that sound, and thus they'll substitute another fricative in that slot. So they'll say something like thumb for thumb, right? So they'll use the F instead of the TH sound. And that's fairly common, right? One reason being that the interdental fricative is hard to articulate. It's one of the phones which is acquired latest in terms of a child figuring out how to produce it. So even though they can recognize it, they produce it as f until they can readily produce the interdental fricative th. That sort of thing happens all the time. You also get things like anticipation. So you'll have things, they'll be trying to say the word tiger, and they'll say Geiger. So they'll take the G from later in the word, they'll anticipate that G, and they'll replace what should be a T with a G, so you end up with 2 G's instead of a T and a G. So tiger becomes Geiger. Things like numb for thumb will also happen. So this would, I would think, likely happen before they would start producing things like thumb. They'll produce something like numb, because not only can they not produce the th sound, but they can't produce the f sound. So they instead they anticipate the nasality of the ending sound of thumb, being the the bilabial nasal stop, and they know that the sound that they're trying to produce is equally kind of frontish, and so they'll produce a n at the beginning of the word. So thumb comes out numb. You have all kinds of things like this, all kinds of little processes. I mean, the list goes on and on, really, of the sort of common processes that children will do. Syntactically, they will, well, I should say morphologically, they will do things known as overgeneralization. So it's generally the case that children will start saying the word go. When they get to the grammatical morpheme stage, they'll be able to say things like went. It seems like right off the bat they'll get went, because they know they'll hear went as the past tense of go, and certainly they've never heard something like goed. But the interesting part of that is, over time, a little bit of time, they will start producing things like goed, even though they've certainly never heard an adult say goed. And this is what's known as overgeneralization. So they will start hearing other verbs that take this d at the end to make past tense, and they'll say, oh, well, that must be the rule to make a past tense verb, put a verb in the past tense. So I'll just add d to all my verbs, and that'll make them in the past tense. And so they'll stop producing went, and they'll start producing goed as an overgeneralization. And it's not till even later on that they hear, well, no, actually went is the correct form. You don't want to say goed, and so they'll start producing went instead of goed. Now that's truly novel, because they've never heard goed from an adult, and yet they produce it anyway. So that shows you the psychological reality of the rule building that goes on when children acquire languages. And the reason why such things as a language acquisition device, even though they sound sort of outlandish, that children are born with some sort of implicit language ability, it does seem like the evidence could be looked at in that way. So certainly they are doing this active rule building that seems like it would be difficult with just having input from the outside world and not presented in any kind of a structured way like we would expect would be required for an adult to learn language. Okay. So I think that is all I've got concerning child language acquisition. So the main thing that I want to point out here, children have a critical period. There is something that allows their brains to pick up language and structure it in a detailed way when they just get regular input from the outside world. Now imagine dropping an adult, let's say a speaker of French, dropping them into Beijing and telling them in 5 years I expect you to be fluent in Chinese and all I want you to do is go around and listen to people talk. That's not, it's something that really is unrealistic for an adult. You have to have some kind of instruction and some sort of explanation as to at least some basic words, some basic phrases, so that you can then take those and try and break them down into parts and then build them back up. You have to do something like that. You can't just drop an adult into Beijing and expect them to learn Chinese. However, if you took a newborn and you dropped it into the center of Beijing, hopefully with some sort of parental support, they would learn Chinese, Mandarin, no problem, right? I mean, they would acquire it. Because that's what children do. They're like little language sponges. Now, likewise, let me mention this briefly before I adjourn. The type of acquisition that a child does ends up giving them an understanding of the language second to none. So that is to say, the way you become a native speaker is you acquire a language in this way. So whatever mechanism works in the critical period to allow children to do this is very, very good, because it is, after all, it's the only way to be a native speaker of a language. And what's even more amazing, and I'll leave you guys with this thought, not only is it an amazing mechanism, but you do have native bilinguals. In other words, if you have children that have two languages spoken around them, they can be a native speaker in both languages. So not only is whatever mechanism going on in their head, not only is it figuring out the systems of grammar behind these languages, but it's smart enough to split them up. And it knows what language goes with what. And certainly there's some issues of confusion between, should I speak language A or language B, but in general, they don't get mixed up. And that is quite incredible, if you ask me. So, thank you guys for listening. This has been, like I said, the end of the trilogy on language learning. I've gotten tons and tons of suggestions for topics from you guys, so expect to hear episodes on them in the coming weeks. Once again, thanks for listening. Sorry for the delay. I'll try and get new episodes out as quickly as possible. Thanks again.